centers of the West. And Rio's Olympics, I think, and the fact that Rio is going to host the Olympics has something to do with how successful the Beijing Games were. So there are all these ripple effects in part from 2008. So I think we should think about globally, and I think there'll be a lot of countries outside of the West that will be looking at Shanghai the way they were looking at Beijing and saying, is this a kind of alternative development model? I think this is a wonderful question you had about the architecture. I hadn't thought about it this way, but you could say both ways. It was surprising that Beijing, which has always been branded as the home of traditional, would be as avant-garde and futuristic as it would be. And then it was kind of unsettling because the division of labor, I thought, was supposed to be Beijing represents the past and Shanghai represents the future. And here Beijing, but I think there's some odd, weird, it's not the first time Shanghai has done something that has this weird thing to it, because the Shanghai Museum, which has this ancient ding vessel, I think some of it's a kind of mixed thing. But you're right. I think that the challenge for Shanghai is to do something. The Olympics set the bar really high for Shanghai. And I've talked to a few people in Shanghai who are saying Shanghai has to do something. You can't compete at the level of just the way that Beijing did the Olympics. So the people that I kind of admire there are saying what we should do is make it different and distinctively Shanghainese. Let's make it more fun. I don't know that that's going to happen, but I think there's a tension because at the same time there's a real, what the Expo should be is spontaneous and unexpected. That the most memorable World's Fair, the Chicago World's Fair, was memorable not just because of the plans, but because of the Midway kind of craziness that erupted out there, and it became a party. So that's why I when they asked me, I said, don't call it technological, don't say we're going to just have a better firework display. Make it something that somehow uses the river was one thing that people were talking about, that flows, that is a more open event. But whether that'll happen, well, maybe we'll know in a week.
You know, this notion of the relationship between architecture and these fairs that are purported to herald the future or showcase the future, that there is often a leaning back with the architectural style. If you look at now, the 1939 World's Fair was actually unique in that way. It did have such very progressive architecture. But if you look at the Columbian Exposition, 1893, it was all ancient Greece and Rome. It was all neoclassical architecture. And that set the theme for American architecture and urban design for a generation. And yet, it was at that fair that Americans were first introduced in large number to electricity, to the telephone, to canned foods, to soda pop, to hamburgers, to Quaker Oats, Cracker Jacks.
Well, I kind of want to add to that. Perhaps you could say Beijing represents more tradition and Shanghai more modern in the past. But if you look at really the emergence of avant-garde art, avant-garde different forms of art, you could look to Beijing, you do not look to Shanghai. And it has a lot to do, perhaps, with something that I didn't talk about, but it was in my slide. It was about the very effective bureaucratic control that Shanghai has in a sense of the effective municipal authority, much more so than in Beijing. And, in Beijing you have the 279, whatever, the arts, the artist community, and first was in Yuanming Yuan. You would never find anything like that in Shanghai. You have a little bit in the Suzhou-He area. And the same thing with migrant villages. You never find any of that in Shanghai. You find that in Beijing. The Shanghai's municipal government is a very technocratic-oriented but very effective bureaucrat. And you really have to, the localism in China is really quite interesting, which then speaks to your question about whether Shanghai's urban regeneration development really sets the tone for other cities, right? And Shanghai is indeed a place, it does have a collection of very modern, if you look at Pudong, most of the large office buildings were designed by well-known architects around the world, or companies, and Chinese architects organized delegations to Shanghai to, kind of look at these. So that's partially almost the World Expo effect. But in a way that Shanghai is also showing us that it's repeating some of the mistakes that Western cities have made. In terms, for instance, if you look at the elevated highway system that cuts across the city, right? And then you see the kind of air pollution, the effect on the city. And then many of the planners from the West are saying, why can't you learn, right, from the West and the mistakes we've made? So it's really quite a sort of the mixed sort of outcome. The many Chinese cities look to Shanghai as the, you know, the dragon's head in a sense, but many of the planners, not necessarily Chinese planners, but lots of the Western planners who go to Shanghai and would say, why are you still doing all of this? So it really is very much of a mixed bag in that sense. And then in terms of compensation, you will have to kind of, in a sense, understand a little bit, land in China is sort of divided into two types. One is agricultural, one is urban. And most of the agricultural land is collectively owned. So the compensation is in a very different manner, sort of away from the urban land compensation. Because in the urban areas, residents do not own the land. They only own the building, even if they own them. And so the compensation really is about the building. You know, you compensate them and they have another place to live. And then on the island, which was agriculture, it's about livelihood, right? It's about farming land and so on and so forth. So it's a different way of compensating altogether. It's in terms of how much agricultural yields and so on and so forth. And so it's based on that to compensate rural residents. And in the urban areas, that's not used. So even today, that the land ownership is completely bifurcated in China, in urban areas and then in rural areas.